This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is side one of tape number 330, June 23, 1978. I have a copy of Freedom magazine. I think I've mentioned it to you before. And if you order that, I'll give you the address. It has a lot of material, more than I need to put on the tape, articles of interest about the spy systems in the United States. Freedom is put out by the Scientologists, but the research, aside from the organization, I don't know much about the Scientology program, except I know their organization is fantastic in the amount of material that they get out about the suppression of our rights. And when they call it freedom, they mean freedom. I have printed for you the information on ordering this magazine. It's $5 for 10 issues. And believe me, it's worth every cent. The address is printed out is 5930 Franklin Avenue, Hollywood, California, 90028. They have an article about the National Security Agency, which has never been properly investigated or exposed. The National Security Agency is separate from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the FBI, of course, and Navy intelligence. It's a body of the spy system that is immune from being investigated by Congress or anybody else. The Supreme Court just ruled this week that National Security Agency does not have to be investigated or release any information on its spying activities. It's described as the largest and most secret member of America's intelligence community. They've been spying on American citizens, the Freedom magazine says, for over 10 years, but they were formed by President Truman, so that's much more than 10 years. They have been into electronic wire snooping, the use of military plans for civil disturbances on how to control people that ride on the streets. They have secret operations which they monitor and involved in private international telephone and communication systems. The program has been under the control of RCA, Global Concern, the ITT, World Communications, and Western Union International, so that every message that you send overseas or send overseas away from the United States is intercepted. And they have printouts where certain words like assassination or murder or certain names are used. And when you use these vocally, these names are printed out in a form, and they transcribe what you're saying as your voice is saying it. You don't have to send letters. They had a secret mail opening overseas, and wires were opened under the code name Shamrock, and this came to light in 1975, October 1975. Freedom has a rundown on National Security Agency, and I think this is important to get the dates of the institutions by which our freedom was taken away from us, like the National Security Council. Last week I talked about the Herbert Hoover Commission to reorganize the executive office. And the Cloak of Secrecy of National Security Agency was founded in 1952. So you see that it's much more than 10 years of spying. And they said when President Truman issued an executive order directive establishing it, there was no official announcement anywhere in the United States of the order or the text of the directive, and it's been remaining classified for 23 years. The House Intelligence Committee in 1975 had to issue a subpoena to see that directive because the White House didn't want Congress to have access to it. You see, in 1947, you reorganized the White House with the Pentagon inside the White House, and then the White House conformed the National Security Agency, and they're like stepping stones to an apex of power, and the base of it, of course, is all the people that get taken in at the bottom and have to support the weight of these secret organizations. Reading from Freedom, it says there's transcripts of a radio show concerning the French police organization Interpol, which we've spoken about many times, and there are files that are working along with the National Security Agency. And the National Security Agency illegally has been spying for years on the Scientologists. That's why they're writing about it and alerted to it. But they are linked to the Central Intelligence Agency and Interpol and Howard Hughes and Intertel. What is known about the National Security Agency is that there is a top secret. This is what they're saying. The agency is run by the Pentagon, but it's not just under the umbrella of the Pentagon. It's even more secret. It employs 120,000 people in the world, and it has an estimated budget of over $10 billion a year. I said one time that our spying budget was about $99 billion a year, and at first it sounded outrageous, but here is an estimated budget of $10 billion a year, and these are the men that are into breaking and intercepting codes and transmitting international messages. But National Security Agency is virtually immune to any single investigation, as supported by the Supreme Court. Nixon stacked Supreme Court, of course, confirmed this, that NSA is virtually immune to any investigation by other branches of government. A special law was passed by Congress in 1959, another link in the chain of repressions in this country, that provided that there will be no legal requirement for the disclosure of the organization of the National Security Agency or any of the names, the titles, the salaries, or the numbers of persons employed by that agency. Therefore, you may get books by an agent on codes, you may get newspaper articles by these agents. They have a budget of $10 billion, and yet a law was provided in 1959, confirmed by the Supreme Court this week, that they have no legal basis, nobody has a legal basis to say, are you an agent of the National Security Agency? It is a criminal offense to publish any of the National Security Agency secrets. Until the 1975 investigations of the agencies, at the time Senator Church began investigating them, there had never been any congressional committee to probe National Security Agency activities, and no law that would prohibit NSA from engaging in domestic surveillance. While there's a law that we know is completely thrown out the window, the CIA and the police departments and the postal offices, they've infiltrated every branch of the United States government and every political party illegally, and they haven't been prosecuted for that. Yet there's absolutely no law to prohibit the National Security Agency from working in the United States, and therefore under that cloak, the spying still continues on the various citizens of the United States. You can read that resume from Freedom. In that issue, the same issue of the paper, there's a copy of a report, Part 1, by Richard Weiland, and the original documents were sent to me this week from Los Angeles, from Vaughn Young down in Los Angeles. It's called The Secret Report Reveals the Panama Death Plot. This is in this issue of Freedom, but this is an important article because of the links of the Intertel organization, the CIA, and organized crime, and the fact that the Drug Enforcement Agency is just one more extension of that. You see, when you get Interpol and Intertel and DEA and NSA and Hughes and ITT and RCA, all of these corporates have a network that closes in and can keep track of what we do, assassinate people they don't want, plant evidence on other people, and they are all interlocked through many, many documents and through the research of a few dedicated people. In this case again, the Scientologists are responsible for these exposés. When I see so much of the work that they're doing in bringing out the truth of the people who are denying us our freedoms, I sometimes wonder why Scientologists are locked up or in prison or their offices are raided. And the answer is quite clear, that they're trying to tell us something, and I don't think there's enough people in America appreciating what they're doing or subscribing to what they're saying. In this article, and they have a document that they refer to as the DFEO report. The author is Michael A., capital D-E, capital F-E-O. They said a high-ranking official of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, plotted the assassination of the head of Panama's intelligence, according to this secret report that has just been released. Michael A. DeFeo wrote the report. It was sent to the Attorney General June 18, 1975. That was 3 years after the arrest at the Watergate, and a request to investigate the allegations of fraud, irregularity, and misconduct in the drug enforcement agencies, and it has been kept secret, this report, for nearly 3 years until it was released by Freedom newspaper, magazine, and the Scientologists. The report charges the Drug Enforcement Agency had ties with International Intelligence Incorporated, which is Intertel, the party that had been, in quotes, in charge of Howard Hughes' body until he died, but actually kept this unknown person, allegedly, I believe it's Vance Cooper, up in the room drugged. Intertel played that hoax on us and should be broken or exposed for that. But Intertel had strong links with Howard Hughes, despite the Drug Enforcement Agency report that the private detective firm also had associations with organized crime. They have questionable links to the CIA versus the training of their agents and the hiring of CIA employees. Since 1972, with the arrival of a former CIA operative whose Drug Enforcement Agency staff of 19 included 14 formerly of the CIA, we didn't get so much breaking open of the Drug Enforcement Agency. It was after the Watergate that the links of the CIA to DEA began to come open. The Drug Enforcement agents used both the Howard Hughes empire, money from the Super Corporation, and CIA money to gamble in casinos in Las Vegas and Nevada to cover their expenses. This report of Michael Defoe states that a Senate committee investigated charges that the acting DEA chief inspector, whose name is Philip Smith, and his assistant administrator for enforcement, William Durkin, participated in discussions with the Drug Enforcement Agency in which they were going to assassinate the president of Panama, who they suspected of being involved in drug trafficking. I wrote about the plans to assassinate the president of Panama in 1972 in my first Watergate story. Smith said he was informed that the plot had been verified and then neutralized. There was also discussion about the possibility of killing Manuel Noriega, the principal assistant to the president of Panama and the head of the intelligence, and that Smith and Durkin actually proposed that he be killed. It's interesting that the proposals to kill the head of the drug traffic in Panama and the president came at a time just when the Watergate story was breaking, and I guess their lives were spared on that. Connections to Intertel stemmed primarily from Mr. Smith, who had been approached for employment by a private detective agency linked with Howard Hughes Summa Corporation. He was given a trip to NASA, stayed at a hotel that is a client of Intertel, which is synonymous with Howard Hughes. Smith arranged in April 1973 for their agents to receive $20,000 from Summa Corporation for gambling purposes at a Howard Hughes hotel, and the money would be handled by the head of Intertel, Robert Pelican, who used to be one of the chiefs in the Justice Department before he came into Intertel, and he still keeps many of his agents and contacts inside the Justice Department. In July of 1972, this is just 1 month after the Watergate arrest, the Drug Enforcement Agency official wrote a report about intelligence information they had about possible ties between organized crime and Intertel. That's a Howard Hughes organization at Intertel, but that report was never filed, and the Drug Enforcement agents continued with their gambling in the Howard Hughes casinos in Las Vegas and Nevada. And the links of the Justice Department, the Drug Enforcement agents, the assassination teams, the traffic of narcotics is confirmed over and over again in many kinds of reports. This is just one more. In 1974, Operation Croupier was initiated with the idea, in quotes, of investigating drug smuggling in NASA, but was arranged with Mr. Conein, who is supervising Drug Enforcement Agency, who is identified in the Pentagon Papers as the CIA operative in Vietnam, active in the overthrow of the Diem regime. So you see that Mr. Conein, who was active in the drug traffic in Southeast Asia, I have mentioned his name in the Ajax files, also put out by the Scientologists. Mr. Conein works with assassination teams and drug agents, and they could be using the excuse of a drug enforcement agency doing their work to continue assassinating people that they want to knock off, to take over a country, or more important probably, to take over the gambling and the drug traffic, because that's a pretty big business too. It pays more than working for the Justice Department. In 1975, 36 out of 332 employees of the Drug Enforcement Agency are from the CIA, formerly of the CIA. Conein has a staff of 19 individuals. 14 of them are former CIA employees. Here's a man who works with the Drug Enforcement Agency now, part of the assassination teams, linked to the murder of DM and goodness knows how many other people, if we really could investigate all of this, who is taking people from the CIA and putting them in drug enforcement. When Mr. Colby came in the CIA, there was supposed to be a large amount of dismantling of the machinery. Also, when Mr. Schlesinger took over, a lot of men, in quotes, were fired. They were just released to cover their ass in case their name came up at Watergate or other investigations probably, and then were put in these more important jobs, which was a move up instead of down. Robert Feldkamp, Drug Enforcement Agent Director of Public Affairs, said the agency has hired many CIA intelligence analysts investigators. There are now 65 to 70 former CIA employees working in the Drug Enforcement Agency. And Mr. Conein worked with Mr. James P. Muldoon, who represented Security Consultants International and the Central Investigation Agencies, where they established safe houses that could be run by Mr. Conein, and Muldoon and Conein worked in Vietnam together, both part of the CIA. Muldoon has sold Conein nearly $5,000 in surveillance equipment from B.R. Fox Laboratories in Alexandria, Virginia. What this article doesn't say in Freedom is that Mr. Fox also makes weapons and silencers and assassination tools. Or it does go on, I'm sorry, and says that what they called explosives, what Conein calls explosives that he buys from this laboratory, are also assassination devices. So the assassination teams haven't broken up, and they're still operating. The Senate hearings on the DeFeo report that were supposed to come out making the links of organized crime, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Summa Corporation, and Howard Hughes were held behind closed doors, and none of the proceedings were ever released to the public. That's why you're probably hearing about this report for the first time. And for those of you that take the tape, if you want me to copy them and sell them at cost to you, I will. I haven't figured out how many pages they are of this report of Michael DeFeo, but I have it here and I can copy it if you want it, and I'll let you know next week what it comes to. Those of you that have the Ajax file may want this file, because there's been a massive cover-up all this time on the links of these organizations. If too many people make the connections, maybe the Drug Enforcement Agency would have to explain why there's so many CIA people working for them. But as yet, there are not enough people making these connections, and so they can get away with silencing these reports. The Freedom issue also asks the Holocaust, could it reoccur? And it goes into the origin of the Catholic Church being repressed, as well as the Jews and the Protestants and the Gypsies, and it tells the danger that Adolf Hitler had when his Third Reich became the Church. And a lot of people think of Adolf Hitler in terms of just repressing Jews in concentration camps and Gypsies, but there's an article in this issue of Freedom that says that the Reich Church was to be the only church, and Adolf Hitler wanted to abandon, of course, the entire Old Testament and revise the New Testament. And he made resolutions in Nazi Germany that required all pastors to take an oath of office of allegiance to Adolf Hitler. He said about Protestants, and quote, "You can do anything you want with them, they'll all submit. They are insignificant little people, submissive as dogs, and they sweat with embarrassment when you talk to them." End quote. One of the first pastors to be arrested in Germany was a pastor, Niemöller. He was arrested in July in 1937 and taken to prison. 870 other pastors were arrested and taken to prison. The orators were on the church pulpit route were supposed to talk about Mein Kampf, and the only book that was placed on the altar was a copy of Mein Kampf, and they were to remove all Christian crosses from the churches, cathedrals, or chapels. I'm bringing this up because a lot of people think that my disgust of Nazism has to do with just Adolf Hitler's attitude toward the Jews. One of the big problems in this country is that the Gentile has not been educated as to what Adolf Hitler means. They shrug their shoulder, oh, just Jew or black, how does that affect me? But they haven't really read the accounts of what went on in Germany that affected all the people, or they would have a different attitude. Catholic publications were suppressed, and the Reich Church was the only legal church in Nazi Germany, and its symbol was a swastika. By 1939, the pogroms escalated. The Jews had to wear the Star of David to identify them publicly, and then, of course, the large concentration camps were built for genocide, but they, as I say, they didn't hold just Jews. There were many good Jews that went into this. At the end of the war, according to this article on Nazis in the Freedom Issue, many of the SS officers in charge of the killings vanished. Some reappeared later with new identities as members of French international police organization Interpol, which I keep stressing because Interpol and Intertel and Howard Hughes and ITT and the Nazi connections are there today. Simon Wiesenthal compared the Interpol operations with the tactics of the Gestapo in Germany. They have files on everybody. The Gestapo would blackmail these people and press them to vote for them. I bring this up now because I think of Joseph Montoya, a member of the Senate Watergate Committee who just died last week, a week and a half ago at the age of 62. Joseph Montoya was from New Mexico. He was a Democrat, and he was very weak. If you read the questions on the Watergate hearings, and I have the hearings here, his questions were weak. He sat there like a dummy, like he was doped, and he let the chance to ask questions that would open up the Watergate story completely pass him by. Of course, we do have Mr. William Colby's report that every member of the Senate Select Committee was under the control of the CIA before the Senate began. But to show you how Interpol blackmails, how the Nazis blackmail, and J. Edgar Hoover, as vice president of Interpol, was a master blackmailer of all times. There's a quotation of Mr. Montoya. It was in the New York Times. He said, he was alleged to have said in 1970 in his election campaign to the Senate, in quotes, "The way to succeed in politics is by talking to the people and voting for the special interests." He had always been accused of being a tool of the special interests. By 1976, his name was brought up with scandals regarding a shopping center he owned in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there were allegations by the Internal Revenue when they went into his budget that he had been given some special treatment regarding his tax returns. You see, 1973-74, he covers up the investigation of the Watergate. And what did they have on Mr. Montoya? A little scandal. There even talks that he was linked to the mafia and that he had this shopping center and that the IRS would go easy on him, of course, if he would go along with the Watergate Committee. Mr. Montoya, in quotes, was said to be a millionaire. He was briefly in the news last year when a federal indictment against Tong-Sun Park, the South Korean businessman, involved in alleged attempts by Seoul to buy influence in the United States Senate, asserted that the New Mexican, Joseph Montoya, was one of the American politicians whose election campaign Mr. Parks had supported. You see, Congress is run and the Senate is investigated, just like the House Select Committee members, on what you have on people. You get these committees going and you make sure that you have the goods on them so that you don't get honest investigations, and this is one way to control them. There's an article this week about Sun Myung-moon leaving the United States and running off to London because he was supposed to testify regarding the South Korean intelligence money going to Mr. Moon. But I want to share this with you in case you didn't see it. It was an AP story, June the 7th, and it was covered in other stories around the country. But the connivance of Mr. Moon at the height of Watergate to protect President Nixon, to have demonstrations on the street, rallies in New York City, to protest the unfair treatment that our politicians who are crooks are getting, is paid. It's recycled money from the CIA back to the Korean CIA and back to this country. And it's important that these pieces be put together because not only is Sun Moon running away from answering questions about his links to the Korean CIA and bribing of our congressmen, but because of the allegations that he again is tied to Adolf Hitler's money and the money that is used to spread his so-called Christian movement, which is really a front for this gunpowder manufacturer, taking the young people of America and diverting them from the serious studies that they have to do. Reverend Moon was, in quotes, on at least one occasion receiving Korean Central Intelligence Agency money. According to the reports, Mr. Moon left the United States for London just this last week, shortly before the House International Relations Subcommittee tried to subpoena him to testify. They said, in quotes, they didn't know if he was evading the subpoena, but by coincidence he was supposed to be called on Tuesday, and he scrammed out of the country. Reverend Moon had truckloads of followers brought to Washington for one of his famous demonstrations in September 1974. He was supposed to have them there. They were chased out of town, I believe, at the time, and it was called off. But he got orders from Seoul in South Korea to stage a demonstration, and the Korean agencies gave him money, according to one defector, for him to have these demonstrations. And they arranged for his demonstration September 14th, 1974. This was money coming from South Korea. He was supposed to have demonstrations against Japan's lack of cooperation in finding out who killed the wife of South Korean President Park Chung-hee. But I'm sure that South Korean President Park Chung-hee could find out who killed his wife without having demonstrations in America. This was at a time when Reverend Moon was prominent in defending Richard Nixon. In quotes, the New York Times said the KCIA, that's the Korean CIA, had used Reverend Moon and members of his Unification Church to stage rallies in the United States in support of the Korean government, their policies and aims, and at least one occasion he got funds for that purpose, at least one occasion. As I say, Reverend Moon has flipped out of here. He's gone away. I don't know how soon he'll be back to testify, but when we break the secret of Reverend Moon, we'll know more about the Christian movement that's going on in this country with influencing the minds of young people and their links to the Korean CIA and the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States. In addition to buying off congressmen through CIA money and KCIA money, there's a wonderful business in the United States now called public relations offices. There's an article by Andrea Frischman and Alan White, Richard Allen White, that was in the Los Angeles Times a few weeks ago, called The Selling of Argentina. Madison Avenue packages repression. We not only package Reverend Moon to hide the crimes of the President of the United States or the Vice President and to take these young people away from what they should be doing, which is specifically studying American history, but this article talks about New York Madison Avenue offices that represent dictators to sell them to us at home. So as we sit over our beer and watch the news and read newspapers, we'll feel kindly towards these people. This article goes into the PR firm of Reuter and Finn that handles the Shah of Iran, and Doremus and Company also handle them. The Philippine Central Bank is another one of their clients, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia are represented them. Mr. Rudah's interest was promoted in this firm by Michael Moynihan and Associates and Company, headed by the brother of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan from New York. Marion Javits, the wife of Senator Jacob Javits, worked with Reuter and Finn's accounts for the Shah of Iran. The foreign governments, the article states, have to use public relations offices to sell countries, and now the one that's currently selling you Argentina is called Burson Mart Seller, a major New York advertising agency with offices in Los Angeles, Chicago, and other countries. It is known in Madison Avenue as the BM Agency, and I call it the BM Agency too. We can give it the same name. I agree, it's the BM. In 1976, the head of the Argentine government, General George Videla, became worried about the impact of his military dictatorship on public opinion. I'm reading to you from the Los Angeles Times and a report from Amnesty International about the BM public relation firms. It said that the Argentine strongman was upset. He had to sell his country and put the minds of the world to rest about his country. And there was a memo from Burson Marsteller, that's the BM publicity agency, to the Argentine government, which Amnesty International got. They won a 1977 Nobel Peace Prize for this report. It's a 33-page document. And it said, certainly in the 2 years since the military coup brought Videla to power, the world press has been critical of mass repression and the violation of human rights in Argentina. At least 15,000 men and women and children have disappeared. 8,000 to 10,000 are currently in prison. Many are subjected to brutal torture and detention without charge or trial. The Argentine Anti-Communist Association is a far-right terrorist group. It's Nazi with anti-Semitic leanings. And the job of the public relations group is to soften the terrorism and do a report so that the repression doesn't go around the world. They said it influences the press to have this kind of report going out, and they have a detailed account of what to do about this kind of bad press. They were to go to bankers, commercial interests, travel agents, and reporters, and they invited reporters down to Argentina to examine the country to make sure that everything is really going fine down there. And Martzeller invited 30 to 40 VIP of the press, and Madison Avenue is in the business of selling you military dictatorships from Iran, Brazil, Argentina, all over the world where the rights of people do not exist. There's something wrong with our system when they can just buy the press to sell fascism, which is what the Minister of Propaganda did in Nazi Germany, Mr. Goebel. This is Mae Brussell, Carmel, California. This is tape number 333. It's June 23rd, and it's side 2. I hope you'll forgive the abruptness, the way the tapes end sometime. It's a little hard to figure it out being at home. I don't know why, than it is at KLRB where the 30 minutes goes around right to the second. I guess I'm more relaxed here at home, and the time slips away, so you'll just have to bear with me if they do end abruptly. And be sure I'll be there either on the next side or next week and take it as it comes. I do think in studying the history of America and who's doing us in, because there is a systematic doing of us in, that the pieces will come together as we put the organizations and the dates into chronological order. I've been doing that quite a few years, but I still have a lot more to do. I don't know how long I'll be at it. But you can help me with your work, too. You can do a little research on the beginning of organizations for me, say such as the Federal Reserve Board, the day that it started and who was behind it. The Defense Intelligence Agency was started by John Kennedy when he was in office, and then it was used for his assassination. I don't know who advised him to set it up, but then it was used against him. The National Security Agency, as I said on the other side, was formed by Harry Truman, and even the Congress didn't know that it existed. The NASA, forming of NASA with Lyndon Johnson as the head of it, was the Nazi space scientists that came to this country, and the dates that it organized and then was named later in the assassination cabal are important. The Bilderbergers, the Council of Foreign Relations, as I say, all these organizations, the forming of the Birch Society, Security Exchange Commission, who is behind these things? I believe that there was a constitution set with checks and balances, as I've said before, and then various persons, particularly after the revolution in Russia, became panicky, or just prior to the revolution when the Rockefellers wanted to control all the gold, not all the gold, all the oil in the world, and set about Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, to have a monopoly on the oil over the entire world. How much was in their hands, and their lawyers, and their Secretary of States, and then in the head of our OSS and the CIA, has this always been run by the dream of the Rockefellers and Standard Oil to control the oil that is on planet Earth. Just this week I picked up a book, which I've had in my library a long time, called A Tough, Fair Look at the Powerful Bureau Investigating the FBI. And it has to do with a conference that was at Princeton, New Jersey, when J. Edgar Hoover was still alive. There was a conference described as a historic conference on the FBI at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. Now, I never could figure out while the conference was going on that certain researchers that were there, like I.F. Stone or Bill Turner, never brought in any information about the assassinations that J. Edgar Hoover covered up. The conference was held in 1971, and as I say, there's a few questions there by I.F. Stone in his book, but nothing important at all that pinned out J. Edgar Hoover. But in the book on the FBI, on page 49, there's an interesting thing which I was never aware before, and it said the history of the FBI, democracy's development of a secret police. Democracy's development of a secret police. It said when Charles Bonaparte, grandnephew of Emperor Napoleon I and Attorney General of the United States under President Theodore Roosevelt, sought funds in 1907 and 1908 for a permanent detective force in the Department of Justice. The reaction was hostile and fierce in the House Appropriation Committee. But that didn't last long. Now, I didn't know that Mr. Bonaparte, the grandnephew of Napoleon, was not only Secretary of the Navy, but that he was in the Justice Department and one who wanted this private detective force because, as I think I've mentioned before, the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, and the Napoleonic quest for all of Europe to combine and Africa and to conquer Russia was the Second Reich. Adolf Hitler was the Third Reich, and then the Fourth Reich is what we discuss about each week, of course, on these tapes. But it goes into the fact that by 1907, the Bureau was on its way, but he was the first person who had suggested, Mr. Bonaparte had suggested a spy system, a system of espionage, and so forth, and that he was very active in getting the first FBI started. And in 1932, they were well on their way and were following unsanctified sexual activities with great gusto. This is in the book on the FBI, and it goes into their brothels and so forth. As I said, on the other side, blackmail is a good tool to control members of Congress. I was interested in the book because it mentioned Mr. Bonaparte, and I was reading a book, another one which I'm very much involved in, is called The Bouviers, The Portrait of an American Family. It's by John H. Davis, and it doesn't tell you very much about Jacqueline Bouvier and the political Bouviers in France, this book in particular, but it still gives a good background on Jacqueline Bouvier's family and uncles and the factors that made Jacqueline, because I believe that the Onassis-Jacqueline connection is still one of the big connecting parts of this whole saga of the conspiracies and the assassinations and the subsequent cover-ups. So that everything I can read on Aristotle Onassis and his Antarctica expedition or the Bouvier connections to Onassis, of course, interests me. And I will keep studying those. And for your homework, you might also send in the dates and origins of these various agencies if you read about them and it's convenient to pull them out. And then also give me the source of the information so I'll have it. There was a settlement out here in the California jails that didn't mean much to the people in the East. They even read it at all. My Eastern newspapers don't have anything about it. Just one newspaper here, although it was an AP wire service, it didn't seem to get to the Eastern papers. And it has to do with a man named Fred Billingsley, who you may or may not know of, who was important to me in my research for quite a while. Billingsley's family was given $50,000 settlement as a result of a lawsuit because 8 years ago, he was gassed and choked and thrown into solitary confinement at San Quentin State Prison. He was alive when he went in, and he was dead when he was taken out. And as a result of his death, there were a lot of events that led to the shootout of Jonathan Jackson when Judge Haley was murdered, and then the trial of Angela Davis. A lot of men in prison were just outrageously angry over the death of Fred Billingsley. And I was interested in him. He had never had a prior felony conviction, and he was in segregated section at San Quentin. But he was taken in for what they called, prison officials called, several mental breakdowns. And from what I knew about Billingsley, he was one of the first persons that gave us an inkling of the MK Ultra program of the Central Intelligence Agency in the California prisons. They said that one night when he died that he had gone berserk and set the mattress on fire, and they had to throw tear gas at him, and he was in solitary confinement. He died of a fractured larynx. But according to his mother, there was a bigger story to it, and she talked about not really wanting to make a settlement. They wanted justice done, but the family was given $50,000. But Billingsley was a person who was subjected to mind control in the California prisons, and the shootout was supposed to be in retaliation for what they did to Billingsley, that they responded. And I think the men there felt trapped and with no way out, and the shootout took place because of that, or because Billingsley was killed. The Los Angeles Police Department set up an entrapment because Louis Tackwood did say, remember, that the guns for the shootout were up in Marin County, provided by the Los Angeles Police Department. Once Billingsley was dead, they counteracted with his dramatic Angela Davis arrest and trial. Weapons provided by Ed Davis and covered up by our current Attorney General, Evel Younger, who's running for government. I had a long talk this week with Sherman Skolnick in Chicago. I gave you, those of you that have last week's tape, his address. And he was talking about Lieutenant Colonel G.H. White, who is the instigator not only of the mind control program, but he believes the brainwashing program that had to do with the assassinations. And, of course, he worked with the Central Intelligence Agency and the OSS, and he lived right up here in Los Altos, California, right outside of San Francisco. And the mental programs at Vacaville and San Quentin with the prisoners were very, very close geographically, 20 or 35 miles away from George Hunter White. George Hunter White's name came out not too long ago in the news when his wife had these diaries. It was at the time that Senator Church was investigating the MK-Ultra program, the mind programs of the CIA. And she said, well, my husband has these diaries. His name is George Hunter White, and she would like to give them to Foothill College. I have to go up and see if I can get permission and see these diaries. The widow's name is Albertina. And she turned them over, and they're about her husband's work in the OSS and the CIA. And originally her husband infiltrated the Tong Song Gang. This predated the Mafia. And I'm sure there were people in our government that were very much into the drug traffic in Southeast Asia, wanting to get a piece of the action a long time ago. He was part of infiltrating that gang and was aware of the narcotics traffic in Asia from 1920 to 1932. In 1942, he went to Oshawa, Toronto, to work for British intelligence, and that was a school that it trains murder and what they call mayhem. And that's where the first work began with truth serums and assassination techniques. Lieutenant Colonel White then went into the OSS, then became an officer in the CIA, and one of the men he worked with was Morgan Hall. Their names were in the news with regards to the whorehouses they had in San Francisco, the surreptitious LSD put in people's drinks at bars, and they would get women to seduce them and take them to these rooms and photograph them. Sherman Skolnick believes that Lieutenant Colonel White, George Hunter White, is very important in terms of the assassination because he has information from people in Ohio and Illinois now that Rowell, R-A-O-U-E-L, who is James Earl Ray's contact, worked with Lieutenant Colonel White in Illinois. Rowell, he said, lives in Calumet City, Illinois at the present time. When James Earl Ray left the Missouri Penitentiary, he went right to Illinois, where he worked at a restaurant and received telephone calls and, I believe, Cook's Restaurant, and met people and was familiar with the territory and was very close to his family that lived nearby also before he went on to Canada. And Rowell gave him the money to travel back and forth and go down to Mexico and Birmingham and escorted him all around. I understand that Rowell is guarded by the Secret Service and that he had been working for White, Mr. White, Lieutenant Colonel White, George Hunter White, as a narc agent years ago. Sherman said that if you get Time magazine, and maybe some of you can do this, I haven't been to the library to look this up. He said in June of 1954, one of the weeks in 1954, I believe it was in the 50s, there's a picture of Rowell. There's an article about narcotics informer in Houston, Texas, and that if you see that article, that's a picture of Rowell, the man who accompanied James Earl Ray, who now lives in Calumet City, Illinois. That doesn't sound so far-fetched when you consider all the work that's been done on Thane Eugene Caesar, the man allegedly who killed Robert Kennedy, who still lives in Los Angeles and floats around and isn't arrested. Sherman said that Lieutenant Colonel White is the founder of the MK-Ultra program, as well as working with the assassination teams, and that his diaries, if I go up to read them, will show a certain vocabulary, which some of the words were new to me, some aren't. He refers to poison pen, which is the various techniques of murder. When you send a victory package to somebody, that means murder by blowing them up or bombing them, exploding. Sherman said MK-Ultra in the mind control program just meant that, mind control program, testing surreptitiously the medications. But the MK-Delta, the difference was the assassination, that they would use the drugs to kill. I always thought that MK Ultra and Delta were two extensions of the mind control program, but he says that each of them has a different meaning, and one is to kill. Colonel White also talks about a cover he used in Los Angeles called a food packing plant, and I think that's important because I'm leery of the chemicals in foods and the way people can be murdered from the packaging of foods, and he refers to food packing plant in Los Angeles. I will have to get up to Los Gatos and see those diaries. I think the food packing story is very important, particularly after I was aware of the dieldrin, the cancer-causing chemicals in food lunch programs going to Detroit and Chicago. But I don't know how many of you read the words of the speech at Harvard that Mr. Solzenitsyn gave this week. I was really proud of Rosalind Carter for answering back to that dog, this cold warrior, but he gave us a good scolding. He didn't account for his $350,000 home in Vermont that he got out of American taxes or tax dollars. I'm sure it's tax-free. But he said, in quotes, those in America who opposed the Vietnam War were guilty now of complicity in the suffering of 30 million people. And he goes on that we should have gone on with that war and kept it going. But he had a quotation in his speech that I thought was important. He said, an oil company is legally blameless when it purchases an invention of a new type of energy in order to prevent its use, he said. In quotes, a food product manufacturer is legally blameless when he poisons his produce to make it last longer. After all, people are free not to buy it. Now, this is Mr. Solzenitsyn, Alexander Solzenitsyn, at Harvard University, talking about my favorite subject, poison in food. Let me repeat it. New York Times, June the 9th, 1978. He said, a food product manufacturer is legally blameless when he poisons his produce to make it last longer. After all, people are free not to buy it. We're getting a surge of Cold War propaganda right now. Mr. Brzezinski, according to the Washington Post, Evans and Novak, is calling the foreign policy shots. Front column article, Brzezinski calls a foreign policy shot. He's running our country identical to the way that Allen Dulles ran it and took the decision-making out of the hands of President Eisenhower. Mr. Solzhenitsyn is at Harvard terrorizing people and praising the Vietnam War and blaming us for what happens right now over there in the suffering of 30 million people. We caused those problems in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, and after bringing all this on, he is attacking us for not going farther in the killing. Solzhenitsyn says, after the suffering of decades of violence and oppression, the human soul longs for something higher and warmer and purer than that offered by today's mass living habits, or the invasion of publicity by TV stupor and by intolerable music. You say, here again we get the attack upon music. This is why I believe and know that particularly the rock musicians were killed and off. The Elvis Presleys, the Beatles were broken up by harassment and possible deportation, and the many, many musicians were killed. Why is Solzhenitsyn, like Spiro Agnew, attacking music? He won't be specific, but he enjoys all the fruits of this society while attacking it at the same time. There's one article in the newspaper saying that he's an outrage that doesn't fit the interests of America. I'm glad a few people can see that Solzhenitsyn is a front for the Tsarist Russia. He protects the old Russia and talks about totalitarian yoke, but never talks about what happened in Russia that caused this phenomena called communism. Mr. Brzezinski was described by Art Cherry, who takes these tapes, in a letter sent to me. He said Andrew Brzezinski accompanied Nixon and stood, it's Andrei Solzhenitsyn, I'm sorry, Zbigniew Brzezinski accompanied Richard Nixon and stood proudly, beaming at his shoulder years ago during the staged trade fair kitchen debate with Richard Nixon and Khrushchev. I guess I'm the only one who knows this, and I suppose Art is, but all the pictures printed show him. Of course, we'd never heard of David's associate in those days, that's David Rockefeller, and now he's unleashing Reinhard Galen's final solution right at this very moment. Brzezinski was everywhere, according to Art Cherry, everywhere that Galen fomented confrontation. The East Germany riots, the Polish riots, the Prague riots, the Belgrade riots, Columbia University riots. He was and is ubiquitous. Hart said he now races Chinese naval cadets up the Great Wall of China for the privilege of kicking the Russians out of Ethiopia. Jimmy Carter refuses to give data on the Cubans to the Foreign Relations Committee in Washington, D.C. They don't want to get caught in another Vietnam. He makes charges against Fidel Castro and very childishly or arrogantly says, I refuse to show them to you. Castro denies the involvement in Zaire, the kind of involvement that Jimmy Carter says we have, and Jimmy Carter says, I refuse to give it out. We heard this just in the last week or so that American and Vietnamese agents have been fomenting unsuccessful coups against the Cambodian government since April of 1975. I read recently that the Cambodian situation is as bad as the Holocaust for the Jews. The only difference is that Hitler was doing the Holocaust then, and the United States is doing it now. And we complain about the oppression and the violence there, and yet we continue to send arms all over the world and to be responsible for the killings. The Cambodian leaders were in the United States, and they said that the CIA and the Vietnamese Secret Service had encouraged the overthrow of the government, were interfering with the policies there and the lives of the people there. Millions of people have died of starvation, and the water and the buffalo and the cattle are destroyed. They have lack of food, and they depend upon foreign aid for food, which they're not getting. Meanwhile, the Western journalists and the diplomats cannot get into Cambodia since 1975, but the CIA is busy trying to foment a coup without any information coming in to give a clear picture of what exactly is going on there. As long as all our news from overseas comes from the CIA, it will be impossible to get a view of what's happening. But it's a terrible sign to see a graduation at Annapolis where Jimmy Carter is throwing the words around as if we're going to a war, as if the men over there will be in Africa the next year. Brzezinski is giving his speeches, threats all over the world of a possible war, and he's in control of the White House, and Mr. Solzenitsyn at Harvard. It just tells you how the learning institutions use these graduations for propaganda tools for these dogs to come up and speak and brainwash a class that has to go out in the world and listen to all that crap. Now, Dow Chemical was in the news this week. They're up to their little tricks again of concealing from workers studies that show that they could have chromosome damage. It's much cheaper to keep them uninformed and let them work till they die than to take the chance that they would need continuous physical examinations to see the harm. I'm reading from, this is the Washington Post, June the 11th, 1978, a report by Rachel Scott from Freeport, Texas. It said a former Dow Chemical researcher has reported significant levels of chromosome damage among the Dow workers who've been exposed to less benzene than the current federal standard allows. This is even having less than the standards allow. They're getting chromosome damage. Abnormalities of chromosomes, the carriers of heredity in every body cell, have been associated with increased risk of cancer and birth defects. Yet Dow Chemical, one of the nation's largest users of benzene, withheld their controversial findings last summer during a series of federal hearings where they were trying to set up standards for workers about their exposure to benzene. The new findings of genetic damage were based on a study of 52 workers who reported to Dow medical officials in June of 1977 by a geneticist, Dr. Dante Picciano, P-I-C-C-I-A-N-O, and he resigned this last March in protest because the corporation refused to disclose the information about the chromosome damage. The chemical industry has contended to federal regulatory agencies that benzene has not been shown to be dangerous at any but high levels, and they're listed here. But benzene, this is a clear liquid of a common industrial chemical used in plastics, synthetic rubbers, fibers, pesticides, and pharmaceuticals, and as a solvent also in gasoline, is known to cause leukemia and other blood disorders. I had to quit, Mr. Pacquiano said, and get out of this because Dow Chemical's response is unethical and immoral. Here at Dow's research laboratory, they studied the white blood cells There's a 2-fold increase in abnormality of the chromosomes, a 10-fold increase in another category of broken chromosomes as compared to a control group of 44 people who were new, who were just applying for the job, who didn't yet have this damage. 2 other consultants, the Dow Chemical, their names are in this article, I don't have to repeat them, agreed with the studies of Mr. Picciano before he resigned. When you have an exposed population with a high incidence of genetic damage, something is going on. There's no doubt about it. This is the quote of Dr. Jean Manson from the University of Cincinnati. I wonder, Charlie Manson came from Cincinnati. I wonder if she's a relative. It says Dow officials said they had not informed their workers of Picciano's report, therefore it would be hard to get a follow-up. They did not inform them of their findings, and he said that after he first presented his results to them at Dow in June of 1977, a year ago, the corporate interest in continued worker studies started to drop off after his report. They weren't interested anymore in these studies, and then they found that his access to the employee exposure data became restricted. And he left Dow Chemical last March, and he said that they have not repeated the studies on the exposed benzoin workers yet to see how this is continuing. They had this information and didn't use it, and these workers continued to be exposed. And the person, again, who catches on and writes a report and turns it in and is morally superior, leaves the department and walks away, and then they can continue to keep the bankrupt ones, the psychologically bankrupt ones, working with them. But when you think that Dow Chemical made napalm and all the other glorious things they manufacture, why would they care about a few workers when workers are cheap and there's unemployment in this country? There's a book that I won't bother to review too much that is coming out. It just came out. But I suggest you read it. If you want a good background, get your library or buy it. It's called Bobby Baker, From the Page Boy to the Prisoner. And many of you don't know the background of Lyndon Johnson, the wheeling, dealing, the woman chasing, the whorehouses, the purple rooms, the handing out vote slips telling people how to vote for Congress. He was a dirty boy, and that's how he could control the Warren Commission, the entire investigation of the Kennedy assassination. Blackmail with Lyndon Johnson was a feast. He used to put himself to bed at night listening to the tape recordings of public officials screwing. LBJ just loved that kind of stuff. He was a horny man who thrived on sex and dirt, and Bobby Baker has written a book called Wheeling and Dealing. He asks in his book, this is a quotation, "I've always been asked how a kid could come out of the South Carolina backwaters and within a relatively short period of time get the reputation of being one of the most powerful men in government." He was a secretary there in the Congress. And then it goes back, he said he claims that in 1948, Lyndon Johnson required instruction from him on how to get along in the Senate, to which Johnson had just been elected. Now, mind you, Johnson at the time had been in Washington 10 years in the House of Representatives. But to get along in the Senate, he has to have the help of Bobby Baker, who'd only been there 6 years. So he pressed him for advice on what Baker says, how do you get things done? Because when you're in the Senate, there's just 2 for each state, and that is a little clique of, as you've seen the reports recently, millionaires, people of influence, the wheelers and dealers, and a lot of important decisions and confirmations come down through the Senate. So if you want to get your boy in, you fix him up with somebody and photograph it, blackmail him, and the games are different. The rules of the game of the Senate are different than the House. And when Lyndon Johnson goes from the House to the Senate, he needs Bobby Baker to tell him what to do. A man that's worked with organized crime and Jimmy Hoffa and the Mafia, and he can tell them what to get done. The book reviewer for the Washington Post said Baker survives and sits down with Larry L. King, I guess, who helped him write his book, and the best little whorehouse in Washington, they referred to that, the book, they said they must have used to compose these memoirs. Larry L. King working, it's Norton Press, Bobby Baker's story of Lyndon Johnson. But this is important because of the power Lyndon Johnson had when the President of the United States was killed in Dealey Plaza. And he's on an airplane coming home, and the Air Force One tells him Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. They had the goods on LBJ. LBJ had it on everybody else. And the American people are the ones that get the screwing. Besides they're running the whorehouses, we're the ones that get the rough treatment, if you'll pardon the expression. LBJ was crude, and Bobby Baker suited his style. In return, LBJ ended up with a museum that was starting to fall apart in Texas, and a life of fear hiding in his ranch when he resigned in 1968 and didn't run again, and a lot of dirty stories that will continue to come out about him. But the aura of a decency in Washington coming down is so fictitious. You have to read the stories of the wheeling and dealing of Richard Nixon running against Jerry Voorhees and Helen Cahagan Douglas, and the rumors that even Earl Warren was responsible for the bludgeoning of his own father. I did a show on that on KLRB about 2 years ago, and a sheriff from Kern County called up and confirmed those rumors. It's a dirty city and the dirty men, and they run it with filth and blackmail. And then at a time like this, they bring their bloody wars with Solzenitsyn and Brzezinski and these dirty, violent white Russian czarists trying to get us in a war of Africa, and war is actually the ultimate in pornography. It isn't a far step from the sexual blackmails to the wars all over Europe to make wealth for the oil companies and the minerals and the counterfeiters and the crooks who are trying to take away our civil rights. Now our time is up. I believe the tape is running short. If you have any questions about the tapes, you can write to me or telephone. I'm usually pretty close to the phone or available. And I'll sign off now. We'll be back together next week, June the 30th, from Carmel, California. This is Mae Brussell. I'll see you next week. I'll be talking to you next week. Some of you I'll see during the week.